All right, hello everybody. We're going to talk nitrogen cycle today. We have two things to look at and pay attention to. We're going to take some written notes on the nitrogen cycle, and then we are going to draw a picture of the nitrogen cycle, which is or will be as far as we need to go for this unit. So for a couple pieces of information about background on nitrogen. So nitrogen, like carbon, like oxygen, like phosphorus, is a primary element for all living things. We can find it within humans, specifically in our proteins and in our DNA, and those two things are going to come up a bit later as well, and in chlorophyll within plants. So if you remember back to your 7th grade science class, chlorophyll is sort of the engine that drives photosynthesis. So obviously super important for plants as well. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, around 78-ish%. And nitrogen is diatomic, so it's found naturally as N2 in the atmosphere, and it is the number one, by far, the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. Next is oxygen at about like 21-ish% from there. So there's a couple questions on the right-hand side. Feel free to answer these as you go today. In this video, I'm going to skip over most of them, so that's something you can do on your own time there. So like I said, on the right-hand side, that's the composition of our Earth's atmosphere. Nitrogen 78%, oxygen 21%, CO2 about 1%, and then a ton of trace amounts of some other stuff. So nitrogen is most commonly formed as a gas in the atmosphere. It can be converted to other forms by bacteria specifically. So this is the first time I mentioned the word bacteria. They are the absolute all-star of what's happening here. So bacteria are super, super important. What I told my other classes is this word right here in your notes, you should like circle, highlight, put a star next to. This is the MVP of this whole process. Super, super important. A couple of the main ones that we are going to chat about are nitrogen gas, N2, nitrates, NO3, and ammonia, NH3. So a small clarification, this last molecule, ammonia, is the actual chemical ammonia. It's not the respiratory illness that some of you may have had a couple months ago, pneumonia. This is ammonia, and if you've ever done any cleaning in your house, you may have used ammonia to help kill some of those germs. And the reason ammonia is so good at killing some of those germs is because it is toxic. It is bad for us. So everything in this pinkish purplish color should be written down on your notes. Nitrogen gas can be found in the atmosphere. Nitrates are good. They are actually essential. They're super, super important. And ammonia, of course, is toxic and bad. So how can we actually get nitrogen gas to nitrates and in ammonia, out of ammonia, etc.? Well, the number one answer, here it comes again, the most important player here is bacteria. There are a couple different types of bacteria in the soil. We have nitrifying bacteria, we have ammonifying bacteria, we have denitrifying bacteria. So all these microorganisms, these super small organisms, help convert nitrogen from one form to another. Now, this is most often found, or most often happens, in the ground, in the soil. So that, of course, would be part of the geosphere, is where this is happening. So that's why soil health is so important, because we need this biodiversity of bacteria in our soil to be able to convert nitrogen to different forms. So these organisms help either add elements, like adding H's or taking H's away and adding O's, that actually help us transform boring old N2 into NH3, taking the H's away, adding O's, and getting us to nitrates, but also taking O's out and putting the N2 back into the atmosphere. So this occurs mostly in the geosphere, and it helps us start with nitrogen gas, N2, getting into the soil, and then release it back up to the atmosphere as well. So how do plants, how do living things get nitrogen? It's essential for all living things, as is water and carbon, But how do we actually get it? Well, starting with plants, plants are locked into the soil already. They have direct access to all of this nitrogen from the soil. So they absorb it through or in the water that they take up through their roots. So this process of absorbing the water in their roots actually allows it to collect some of those nitrates into their plant bodies and to use those nitrates for photosynthesis. So because plants are already sort of locked into the soil, they're able to get the nitrates directly from the soil. Now, you and I, we can't just go outside, put our toes in the soil, and get nitrates. That would be sick, but that's not how it works. So this is very similar to carbon. We can't breathe it in and use it. We can't just absorb it. All right, we're a little bit more complicated than that. We, like carbon again, need to consume our nitrogen. So the only way we can sustain proper amounts of nitrogen in our bodies to allow protein synthesis to happen and allow our DNA to replicate and repair itself, the only way we get that is through the process of consumption. We have to eat plants or animals that have nitrogen in them, and that allows us to actually process it and use it within very, very small cells in our body with our DNA or through protein synthesis as well. These two things, proteins and DNA, are things that are going to be talked about at length in your biology classes next year. Okay, so that's how we get nitrogen into our bodies. So we've talked about nitrogen starts in the atmosphere, it gets into the soil, now we can get it into our bodies, but this is a cycle. So how do we actually get it moving to other places? Well, there's two main ways, and both are kind of gross. The first way that we return nitrogen out of our bodies is if the animal or if us or if the plant dies. That does what we call fixing nitrogen into the soil. So by that decomposition process, that can take plants and put the nitrogen from the plants back into the soil so that other plants can absorb it. The second way is through waste, which, yes, is kind of gross. So this is through human waste or animal waste that can actually return some of that nitrogen into the geosphere. Now, if any of you live on a farm, you knew this slide already, right? Because a lot of times farmers will use organic fertilizer or manure, which is processed waste or poop from animals that they sprinkle onto their crops to help return nitrogen to the soil to allow the plants to grow. So that's how it gets in and out of plants and animals, but also back into the geosphere as well. So this importantly puts the nitrates back into the soil, but it also, I mentioned water here as well. It also gets nitrogen into the water, and we're going to talk about why that's important in a couple slides here. With more nitrates in the soil, that allows bacteria to get its hands on it again, process it again, so it can be either used or released back into the atmosphere as N2. Okay, so like a lot of things we've talked about this year, we haven't really talked about how humans can affect this cycle. So humans, just like water and just like carbon, certainly play a role in the nitrogen cycle. So we mentioned on our previous slide that a lot of the organic fertilizer that's used is manure, which is waste or poop. So there are three main ways that humans influence the nitrogen cycle. Using excess manure, so too much manure is being sprinkled on these crops, some of it gets taken away in rain or in runoff. Two, we have human sewage, which is super disgusting, but if we have a sewage leak or some sewage gets into the waterway, that can get into the soil, so on and so forth. And then finally, chemical or industrial or inorganic fertilizers. So these are ones that are processed in a factory. So like something I might go to Home Depot to buy in a big bag to sprinkle on my lawn, something like that. That is a chemical fertilizer. All three of these are extremely nitrogen rich, which is good, right? Plants need that nitrogen, so that's a good thing. The part that starts to get a little sketchy is when some of this extra nitrogen gets into the runoff and that runoff goes to a local waterway, which is where we're going next. Okay, so if we have just a little bit too much fertilizer that's being put on our crops or put in your backyard or put on your plants or your herbs or whatever, if there's just a little bit too much, that nitrogen runs off, right? Gets caught in that runoff from rain or maybe a flood or whatever. And this excess nitrogen gets into a nearby body of water, right? Because runoff goes from high to low. It's a gravity-driven process. So if there is some runoff from a rainstorm and it brings some of this extra nitrogen into a nearby river, this process is called eutrophication. That's what this bold word is, eutrophication. And this, by definition, is the process of a body of water getting excess nitrogen or excess nitrates or excess nutrients. Now, you might be thinking, well, Mr. Mahadi, that sounds pretty good, right? Like more nutrients or more nitrates in the water, that's a good thing. And you're right, it's not totally a bad thing right away. Because plants need nitrogen to grow, if there's more nitrogen that's in the water, more plants are going to grow. And that's a good thing. Like, that's a win. However, when this happens, when this unrestricted plant growth happens, it has some consequences down the line. So if you have a cabin and you have ever seen your lake, like the picture on the left here, it usually happens like around the June or July time period because all of the fertilizers that have been placed nearby have happened like in April and May. And then that runs off, gets into the lake or the pond or whatever. The algae in the plant starts to grow, and we have what's called an algal bloom or an algae bloom. So it's just this huge explosion of plant growth. And again, not necessarily a bad thing. However, once these plants and these algae eat up all of the nitrates, right? The nitrates are the usable form of nitrogen. Once all of those nitrates are gone, well, then all of a sudden there's no more food for these plants to eat. And if there's no more food for the plants, just similar to our animals from our simulation and resources sustainability and biodiversity, if there's nothing to eat, well, the organisms die. They either have to leave or they die. So if there's all of these nitrates in the water and they all get consumed and they eat all the nitrates, the plants grow like crazy, and then all of a sudden there's no food, all the plants and algae die out, okay, but now we have a bunch of dead plants and algae. And as those plants and algae die, they start to decompose. And bacteria, just like us, they respire when they're working hard. They breathe when they're working hard. Just like if I run a 100-meter sprint, I'm going to be breathing pretty hard. Same thing, bacteria are working really hard to decompose these plants and these algae. So they're using up oxygen. They're breathing really hard as they're doing this. Well, if bacteria are in water and they're using up the dissolved oxygen in the water, that means there's no more dissolved oxygen for plants or animals in the water. That leads to this sort of widespread death, quote unquote, death of the area. If there's no more oxygen in the water, we can't have fish there. We can't have small little crustaceans there because they need oxygen to breathe. So that leads to what we call a dead zone. So this dead zone is a body of water that lacks enough oxygen to support animal and even plant life as well. And these dead zones can happen all over the world, but it's an area where there's literally nothing because those fish either suffocate and die or they have to swim somewhere else to find oxygen. I mean, you can think about it as if you wake up one day and all of a sudden there's no oxygen in your house. Like you got to get out of there or else things are going to get bad. That's the same thing with these fish. Now, this is one that I wanted to talk about on the right-hand side because you can see this pink, all these like pink, they kind of look like veins in your body or something like that. This big pink area in the middle, that's called the Mississippi River watershed. Now, that means that any drop of rain that falls in that pink area is going to filter into the Mississippi River at some point or another. And what you might also notice is that this is covering a lot of the central United States, which is one of the biggest areas in North America for agriculture. Coming with agriculture also brings fertilizers. So if there's any farms in this area that are using excess fertilizers, not saying it's their fault, I'm just saying if they're using excess fertilizers, it can get washed into the water, eventually into the Mississippi River, and then we can have one of the largest dead zones in the world in the Gulf of Mexico, because that's where this watershed dumps out in Louisiana into that Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so quick summary at the bottom here. If we have excess fertilizer from manure or inorganic fertilizer, we have more nitrates in the water, NO3. This process is called eutrophication. And with more nitrates in the water, that leads to more plant growth, not necessarily a bad thing. But those plants consume nitrates. Eventually they run out and those plants die. And when those plants die, they start to break down from bacteria. They get consumed. And those bacteria use up the oxygen. They're breathing just like us when we're working hard. So eventually that leads to an area where there is nothing left. There is no more oxygen. So that area gets kind of wiped out from life until there's a remixing of nutrients and until that area can sustain life one more time. So that wraps up our note section on the nitrogen cycle. If you scroll down, you'll notice there's a blank picture down there. We have another video that will be posted in Schoology that I'd like you to do today, going through this picture and showing how nitrogen literally moves from one bacteria to another. So make sure to check that out, and then we'll be able to wrap up and have a discussion about this tomorrow.